All right, are we all set?
Good.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We are so thrilled that you are able to join us for our first hybrid event on YouTube and here in person here in the custom room of the Framingham Public Library. And we are especially excited tonight because we are joined by Corazzini and Taylor Collins from the Framingham Public Schools. They're joining us as a part of our FRT program. For those of you who aren't familiar, FRT stands for Framingham Reads Together, where we select one book that the whole community reads, and then we create a whole bunch of programs where we can talk about the book. This particular read is especially important. It is Dear Martin by Nic Stone. So if you haven't had the chance to read it, please grab a copy. We have lots at the library. We've got ebooks, audiobooks, and we're especially excited that Nic Stone, the author, will be joining us via Zoom at the end of this month on, well, actually the beginning of next month on October 6th. So keep an eye out for all of these exciting programs, including tonight's. Joe and Taylor, you want to tell us about Stamped?
Yeah, welcome everybody. We're excited to be here in this hybrid situation, and you're talking about going viral on YouTube, but hopefully for the good reasons here. I'm going to start sharing our slideshow. So ours is kind of a mix about the book, but also about like the issues that the book brings up, and we're going to kind of go through those couple things. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's a great book and a different way to look at history. And as they were saying before, I'm a history teacher at the high school. Oops.
That was my bad, sorry.
No, and I'm like, no, I'm just a little, thankfully, a little rusty on Zoom, so it's a good feeling.
Awesome. So, we always like to start off with sort of an acknowledgement of the existing work being done for all the movements that exist, and just to say to folks that part of doing this work is to have an understanding of intersectionality, the idea that we all, one individual can't be free unless we're all collectively free, and so it's just really sort of a head nod to folks in the past and the present who continue to fight for liberty and for justice. So special shout out to them.
And we also like to do an acknowledgement. For a start, we acknowledge the land that we live and work on by naming the Pawtucket, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts people upon whose unceded and stolen territory that the school and the library stands. We further acknowledge the enslaved peoples primarily of African descent whose labor built much of the United States. And I recognize that myself and my ancestors have benefited much from the exploitation of people in the land, and as a white teacher who teaches African American, Black American history and race, I'm aware of my positionality and unearned privilege in teaching this topic area. Due to this, I will always see to the voices, experience, and analysis of Black educators, historians, students, and narratives in this presentation.
Cool. And for me coming to this space, I'm intentionally engaging in this conversation. I'm very conscious of myself as a Black man, and not necessarily having a responsibility to engage in this conversation, but a choice. And I believe equivocally that that we should not expect Black people to share in similar levels of interest, patience, or disposition in terms of their willingness to engage in these conversations. But I also believe, for me personally, that I relate to what Michael Dyson often refers to as Dr. King's appeal to white people's consciousness and to basic American ideals as a strategy for engaging folks. It's really fundamentally built on the idea of redemption. That drives me into the future.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I'll just real quick. We're going to do, so after the walk, just a short presentation, hopefully get time for questions, reflections. Folks can throw them in the chat if you're online, or we'll open it up, I think, at the library. Folks will out to the mic and share stuff.
We love questions and reflections. And so we use these norms, and this is what we ask, and we thank the Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn Singleton for this, but to stay engaged, to speak your truth, experience discomfort, and sometimes even lean into it, and then experience to accept that there's not going to always be closure motives, but there will be non-closure.
I think this is a good quote that I like to use to sort of center our conversation. Our tendency in life is to avoid things that threaten us, but in order to become whole, we need to go deeper and deeper into ourselves by reaching further and further into the things that we feel. In short, that these challenges, these conversations are challenging and they're hard, and oftentimes I think people push away from them, but I think the action of pushing in, is important. And then through our work, through our collective work, I think we try to pull people into these conversations to further create that space for inclusion for all. I'm going to close the great quotes and say it better. To build community requires a vigilant awareness of the work we must continually do to undermine all the socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate domination. The act of coming together requires us to think consciously about the ways in which we may pull apart. I think that's important for people to sort of center themselves around whenever we're having these conversations.
Yeah, and this is a great one. This chart was adapted about like who I want to be during COVID-19, which obviously is still going on. And there were some ideas actually pulled from Dr. Kendi's work here, but the idea of like how to become an anti-racist and going from your fear zone to your growth zone. So, a lot of times the fear zone is avoiding those hard questions and it's trying to stay as comfortable as possible. And we really need to lean into being uncomfortable and looking out about learning their own privilege and then speaking out. So we really want to get to that growth zone where we're becoming anti-racist. But we know that it's a process to get there too. Yeah, I'll play it for it.
What is it you want to do to reconcile that? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. You're taking my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want? All your progress.
But like when I watch that, I think often about the deep sense of frustration that many people, particularly people of color and folks from other marginalized, oppressed communities, the sense of frustration they feel with people's unwillingness to move this work at a faster pace, right? What's your sort of response or your take on questions and thoughts on that?
This made me also think of just recently in the last year, like Stevie Wonder talking about like moving to Ghana and how tired he was of living in a place where he has to tell his grandchildren that they're not seen as like equal people and like trying to explain things to them. And so yeah, you build up and you feel that frustration within it, and when people are like, well, you got this part, take this. And shouldn't you be happy with that? Is that kind of like frustration that we're seeing coming out in James Baldwin?
That's a really interesting reference. And it's actually pretty consistent with a lot of historical Black figures from Malcolm X and Maya Angelou, who essentially left America and went to Africa and to Paris, and involved himself in Paris to escape some of that toxicity. So pretty confident. Want to jump to the next one?
Yeah.
And this one, so I feel like these clips are meant to sort of set us up for the conversation, right? Around like, there's a growing frustration, there's a growing indifference, there's a growing intolerance from communities who've been oppressed and this idea of waiting or for slow progress. And what I've said to folks in the community, in the district, is that the world has required us to have a more nuanced understanding of racism. No longer acceptable is the idea of like the compassionate ear where I listen but don't take action, or where I don't understand and don't look for education. Now families, communities are requiring us to have a much deeper understanding of not just sort of like the definitions but more so the history and implications of the systemic overtures of racism, right? And so this clip right here, I feel like really in under a minute, Malcolm X, and this is at the beginning of right to bear arms speech. So he's getting ready to go and talk about the Second Amendment. But before he does that, he just does this sort of like quick sort of diatribe on like systemic racism, systemic oppression. And so I want to play this because I think he captures in 60 seconds what a lot of folks fail to understand about racism.
It doesn't make any difference what else you have. If you don't have some place to rest your head, you're in bad shape. Here in Harlem, the reason we say that housing is such a key problem, when you live in a poor neighborhood, you're living in an area where you have to have poor schools. When you have poor schools, you have poor teachers. When you have poor teachers, you get a poor education. And when you get a poor education, you are destined to be a poor man and a poor woman the rest of your life. Poor education, you can only work on a poor-paying job. And that poor-paying job enables you to live again in a poor neighborhood. So it's a very vicious cycle.
I feel like that comment is just as powerful and prevalent today as it was in the 1950s and 70s. How would you? Sure.
Yeah, we just had this conversation in my class. I teach the African American Black History class, and we were just talking about the cycle that continues to perpetuate itself, and how the forces are there. So how do we disrupt those kind of forces that are there?
Yeah, man. Can you jump in?
Yeah, jump in, and here's the platform that you can jump in on.
So, we proudly, and I don't know if I was the first one to say it, probably officially as an administrator, at least in central office level, but I know that there's been teachers who've been saying it, Black Lives Matter is not a political statement, it's an affirmation of Black folks' existence. And back to Baldwin's and sort of how long must we wait for your so-called progress. The fact that it's now 2021 and we still are having conversations about Black people and their affirmation of their existence and the oppression and the history that they've come through tells us that there's a lot of work for folks to do in terms of getting more woken up by history and truth. And history is not just in the past, history is in the present. Every second that we pass it is a part of our history. And so one of the reasons I think that it's important to say is because our kids and our Black folks need to hear it, right? But two, one of the reasons I think it's an important movement is that the movement is not just about the isolation of affirming Black existence, but if you look in their platform, they actually say, we are building a movement that brings all of us to the front. We're affirming the lives of Black, queer, and trans folk, of disabled, of undocumented, folks with Black women, all Black lives along the gender spectrum. And that's important because historically, if you look at the civil rights movement, while there's a lot of men of color who've been acknowledged, too often there was the lack of acknowledgement of women of color. And as I said earlier, we can't all get free until we're all free. We have to, this movement is really sort of built on some of the challenges of the civil rights movement, right? So rather than having figureheads, it's dismantled that into individual contributions across, the world really in terms of the movement. It's pushed people, women of color and queer folks to the front of the leadership spectrum first and foremost. And I think that is something when we talk about intersectionality that is critical to coming together, not just giving voice to an issue, but in our actions, creating spaces for the folks who've been marginalized to be the initiators of the change and the leaders of the change. And that's really critical in terms of this work.
Yeah, I think that's also such a major point of Dr. Kendi's book, is this giving it, also showing the power of those that are fighting against it and this movement. And we talked about in class too of like Black Lives Matter. Yes, this started it, you know, and who started? We talked about like how it was everyday women, LGBTQ as well, women that were able to bring this platform forward and use social media. But there's always been a fight that Black Lives Matter throughout history, and this is what the newest kind of like focus on it. But it's also learning from the past of bringing everybody in, kind of like what you were saying, Joe.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, Joe. Some of the folks at home are having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Is there any way you could get a little closer to the mic?
Sure, let me see if I can speak up a little.
Perfect, thanks so much.
Oh, I've never had that issue with you, okay? But it's really, I love these quotes talking about, like, you know, a lot of people talking about, like, political and education becoming political. I mean, education has always been political, right? And being neutral and not talking about this is actually saying a lot more to our students, and it's leaving some of our students completely out of the conversation. So I was just looking at it today and talking about how education has always been a political in a way of power and oppression, and something for us to really look at. What are we saying when we're not really doing anything? It actually is more powerful than, you know, not doing something is more powerful at times, and a louder message to some of our kids and lead some of the kids out as well as other people in the community.
Absolutely.
So we had a couple of terms to just make sure if you have ever seen these, and if you're a fear when you write people of color, children of color, BIPOC, that's something that people are saying. Those are people that identify as African American, Black, Latino, you may see here Latinx, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, biracial. These identities are about 30% of the U.S. population and among the fastest growing populations in the country. And any child in this category born in the U.S., immigrant, refugee, or temporary resident is included in this category for this purpose. So if you ever see that, you might hear it on the news as well. And this one's kind of my favorite cartoon. Try to make, this helped me in one of my first classes, like make sense of this all. So a lot of times we talk about equality and equity, and kids are saying that's not fair, that's not equal. But if you're looking at this, it really shows you the differences between equality and equity, right? Equality is giving everybody the same thing, no matter where they are. So in this case, trying to see the game, the kid on the right is not, still can't see the game. But if we do equity and base it on helping getting everyone participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, you can see that you're adding more on. But we want to go another step forward. Right? We want to liberate and get rid of those barriers. We're getting rid of that fence, you can see the liberation. And then we want to get to inclusion, where we're all in this together instead of separate, right? So this is a really great way to kind of look at it, to see how to get rid of that fence and what we want to do.
I would, I feel like I was just reflecting on this, and I'm like, the one thing I would love for them to add to it is like justice, and justice is like inquiring like who put up a fence in the first place.
Ooh, I love that.
Because that gets at sort of the understanding like how systems are built and how those systems that are built are constructed and create oppressions. I love that slide.
Let's add on to it, Joe. You can do the cartoon business. We also have like the term phrenology, like prejudice and race. So the prejudgment, right, is usually negative, unjustifiable, right? And it's towards an individual or group. Race, this is something that we talk a lot about in classes now, but we're talking about how race is socially constructed. And that's something that was never taught to me when I was growing up. And understanding that there's no really biological justification for race. And that it was used and it was created in order to have basic control. And we've seen some description of racism as prejudice plus power. So using that prejudice and putting up those fences, kind of like what you were saying, Joe, right? Bringing those together.
And the way, this is a great slide, because I think what it does is it visualizes sort of what we've sort of just gone through in the first initial slides, like we talked a little bit about, implicit bias. I've been tried to map out for you sort of like what structural racism actually looks like. And it's a circle, right? It's a vicious cycle. And that cycle starts with sort of crying around associations and assumptions, right? So some folks are untrustworthy, so we need to build fences. And those fences get built through policies, right? And it's historical. It's not fiction. It's not something that was made up, right? There were programs, voting rights, FHA loans, residential segregation, access to education. Most folks don't realize that school integration actually led to the largest mass exodus of black educators, to 38,000 out of the public system, because while we were forced to integrate our students, we were not forced to integrate our staff, right? And so all of these things compound to practices that become norms, that become systematized, that lead to inequitable outcomes and racial disparities, that then prime and again filter into these general assumptions. And for us to really unpack that, right, and think about how does this impact us in our own individual worlds, whether I'm in school, whether I'm in City Hall, whether I'm in a financial institution, a university, or in a private company, we have to really do the history, the knowledge, the understanding, the self-assessment around, like, what's my connection to this, right? And how do I begin to be conscious of the ways in which I've been conditioned by the world and by biases to think in a way in which I trust some folks more than I trust others. I dislike some folks more than I dislike others, right? So it's becoming sort of like that awakening to the way in which bias manifests itself. And one of the easiest examples I use is like stranger danger. Like somewhere along the lines, most of us have been taught that somebody who's different, as a stranger, is different, and that's scary, and that's bad. I'm not sure who specifically told you that or told me that, but I know that consciously it lives within our consciousness. And that's something for us to challenge, right? And something for us to be aware of, because the way in which that looks in other ways can have much larger impacts in terms of the way in which we interact.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, my dog wants to be petted all the time. He's been quiet this whole time. All right, so the video on the next slide, really, I think, I play this for students, and we played it before for Metro West, and people really felt like it helped them kind of understand this a little bit more. So I'm going to play that for you.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias. Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream. Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it. But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racism.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We've never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to bias.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race, and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
My students really like that video and talking about that video because of the impact that we have, and even though we know that these messages have been sent to them, how to unpack those and then to attack them.
Implicit bias.
Sorry. Okay. So getting to the book, this is something we've been talking about, and I just did this with kids. We're talking about the great part about this book. Jason Reynolds, who's amazing, takes Dr. Kendi's work and uses this in a remix version that's more friendly for kids or young adults. And then there's another one for younger kids, and then there's a baby one. The baby one seemed a little hard for me, but this one talks about a couple key words, like segregationists are haters, like real haters, people who hate you for not being like them, assimilation people who like you, but only with quotation marks, meaning they like you because you're like them. And then there's anti-racist. They love you because you're like you. But it's important to note that life can rarely be wrapped into a single word description. I talked about with kids that it kind of ebbs and flows. You're not saying like this, excuse the pun, but black and white, that you're racist or not racist, right? It continues on, and something that you're continually fighting against. And it says, over a course of a lifetime, and even over the course of a day, people can take on and act out these ideas represented by more than one of these three identities, right? So one situation you're in, you don't feel like facing and fighting up and saying, hey man, that joke's not funny, right? Even though you know it's not and you want to be anti-racist, there can be issues with it. So it's constant, like, always trying to battle with it, too. And I think we love labeling good and bad on people, like, you know, like presidents and people in history and people wherever. And this is something for us to see that there are shades of gray in between. And so he also uses racist, one that supports a racist policy, through action to inaction. So that's something to think about, is the inaction that I really like that Kendi talks about. Racist policy, it says any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity. And then racism, with him, you know, they talk about prejudice and power, some definitions. And with Kendi, he says a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequality and is substantiated by racist ideas. Joe, these are your slides, my friend. You're muted.
Thank you. I always throw, I like to throw art into any presentation because I feel like art's like the storytellers of our world. And I throw in, these are some pretty famous hip-hop artists. Some are still big, and most of them come back from sort of date me in terms of my time around music, hip-hop, or preference on music, hip-hop. But like, it tells a story, right? And oftentimes, we get caught up in terms of our own indifference around what bias means or racism means, and we get so on the fences that we don't hear where people are coming from, right? So I use these quotes because these are quotes that I think draw a lot of young folks who can relate to them, right? And they're powerful quotes, right? One from Sean Carter, Jay-Z. And one of his lines, he says, now the teacher couldn't reach me, my mama couldn't beat me hard enough to match the pain of my pops. I'm not seeing you so with that disdain in my membrane, out of my pin brain, that's the world, right? A young person who's struggling with, in their experience, they're like, he's dealing with some hardship of like living in a single parent home, right? And he's talking about the ways institutions aren't connecting with him, and his whole sort of frame of reference being like, forget the world, I'm in this sort of alone. You jump to the next slide, and you see Christopher Wallace, who joins B.I.G., one of hip-hop's greatest pioneers, and in his most famous song, Juicy, which is still a head bopper, like, his first line he says in there is like, this is for all the teachers that told me I'd never climb a mountain. Like, how powerful of a statement is that? That a young person, when they make it, the first thing that they say is they want to dedicate this to the folks who are supposed to be the ones to inspire their success. But inspire from a place of good, not from a place of various obstacles to overcome, right? He goes on to say, consider food because I dropped out of high school. Stereotypes of a black male misunderstood, and it's still all good. Meaning, like, the stereotypes and way in which they talk about us are totally off, and people don't truly understand it because they don't understand our experiences, but it's still all good, right? I'm still gonna be me. Next slide you jump to, we see DMX, who just recently passed away, a rapper who died from his addiction. And he starts talking, here's one of his most famous songs, about group homes and institutions preparing him for jail. They put him in a situation forcing him to be a man when he was just learning to stand without a helping hand. Damn, was it my fault, something I did to make a father leave his first kid at 7 doing my first kid, right? The experiences our young people are telling us that they're going through, this young gentleman going into the foster care, into group institutions that are supposed to be supposed to alleviate hardship and trouble and mental crisis, causing some of that infliction and pain, right? It's critical that when we're in these moments of trying to break through and teach and educate, that we're conscious of the way in which our young people are experiencing the world and the opportunities that we have as adults and educators to facilitate a process for greater opening and awareness and reflection, or for being closed door and cutting off conversation. And what I always say in the district, and I think it applies to in general in life, is that our job is not necessarily to indoctrinate anybody into our political beliefs or values. Our job is to enact our mission and our vision in our work as our life and our actions. And we want people to see by the words that we say, by the actions that we take, what we stand about. If we stand about inclusion, we should speak up when there's a lack of inclusion. If we talk about being anti-racist, we should be on a daily basis working to dismantle systems that have perpetuated racism in our country. And as we're doing that, it doesn't need to be siloed to simply just race, right? Or just, like gender. All folks are welcome in that conversation. We have brothers and sisters who are trans, who are queer, folks who have disabilities, folks who are undocumented. We are all in the same struggle, fighting for the same level of freedom, that pursuit of happiness. And it's the willingness that we take each and every day to try to be empathetic that's going to drive us either towards inclusion and coming together, or the ignorance that keeps us from having these conversations and pushes us. Now, most of us may not have been around for some of these incidents in history. I certainly wasn't around for this one. Let's look at the next one. I wasn't here when schools were integrated, and I was not part of any policy or process that called for the segregated schools. And I sure wasn't a part of any kind of state law in Arizona that prohibited the teaching of ethnic studies. But as a leader in an institution, a public institution, educational institution, I take on that history, right? So folks don't just see me as Joe Corazzini, the kid who kind of worked his way up and, as a teen dad. They see me as being an instrument of a system that has caused them some level of hardship and oppression. Our officers see that when they're in the community. They say, I'm a good officer. Every day I go out and I try to do the best. I'm in the community. And sometimes I'm met with some vitriol from people in the community about who they think I am because I'm wearing that badge. But when they're wearing that badge in the uniform, they're also wearing the legacy of that institution. That way before them, all the good, all the bad that came, the same way that we wear that same history for our education institution. And in that moment, what I try to explain to folks is that it's really critical that we're examining the history of our institutions, depersonalizing the distrust that communities have with us, and working to establish honest, authentic relationships where we can engage in these kind of conversations. Because until we can get to the level of some truth-telling, I'm not talking about the truth-telling where we're all nice and cordial and we speak highly of each other. I'm talking about that grandma truth-telling and tell you about yourself on a Sunday morning, slap you upside the head and give you a biscuit, some grits, and some fried eggs, truth-telling. That you know that when it comes, it's hard, and you're doing some deep soul searching, and you may not like it in the moment, but you know that at the core of it, it's centered in love. And I say that because it's most important that when we do this work, we always speak through a lens justice, but through a language of love. And in that love, we can tell truths, and you can live in your truth about your experience, and I can live in my truth about my experience. We can find a place where those truths can coexist, and we can come together for creating better opportunities for all of us. So you just gotta check your lens. You know, like when you come into the world, you come into a room, you come into a space, when you're coming into an environment, you wanna do good, great. You wanna help out, great. You're having a tough day, great. But check the lens in which you come into a space. Because the identities you carry, you cannot leave at the door. They're inherently instilled in you. That bias, that prejudice is instilled in you as it is within me. And the only way you can counteract that is to be honest that it exists and to be conscious of working against it. You're going to be met with a lot of frustrations. Let's take the next slide. But those frustrations are part of the process, because inherently some folks are going to see things differently. Some folks look at this side and they see 3. Some folks look at this side and they see 4 laws. That's okay, right? We don't all have to agree. We can see things differently, but the conversation gives us better perspective on why you perceive things differently, right? If you take a look at it initially, you saw 3, maybe somebody points something out and said, oh, can you see the 4th law there? And you say, oh, okay. We can't get to that aha moment unless we engage and say, instead of starting from a perspective like, no, you're wrong, no, you're different, no, your perspective is invalid, or you haven't explained it in a way in which I get it, so therefore it's not true. Inquiry, ask, why do you see it like that? Oh, I start like this. Show me again where you start like that. Like that's what we're trying to do in this process. Like inquiry, honest inquiry about where people's experiences have led them and why they feel what they feel. And of course I show this because I feel like it's one of the great examples, because then people just inherently have different vision. And so if I ask somebody what color strawberry is, okay, what color do you see in terms of strawberry?
Like, really red?
Like, yeah, me too, like, you know, like, and it's crazy, right? Because I was like trying to find examples of this years ago around like seeing things differently, and I saw this, I was like, this is just perfect. And the question I asked myself is, so what makes a strawberry red if somebody sees it green? What?
Like that, remember the dress where people couldn't see if it was gold and white or blue and black? You remember that?
Yeah.
That was a huge controversy, right? It's just like, yeah, how do you see it, and how do you know that that's what you're seeing, what they're seeing is not right?
And the question we have to ask ourselves as a society is like, so then what makes, you know, what color is a strawberry? And what too often happens is people say, well, strawberry's red. Even when they saw the green strawberry's red. Why? Because that's what I've been on, right? And that's what the majority of people think. Well, being in the majority doesn't mean that you're right? People can see things differently. So I still this thing, because I feel like people need to get ready to get uncomfortable and to have some frustrated faces looking back at them when you're engaging in this work. But that's the work, right? That's the work when we're trying to dismantle these systems.
And again, yeah, I always say, and I think it's important to continue to say, like, we were not here to start these institutions and started that, but it's important when we look at our identity and that to understand that they're there and how that influences people's experiences, and then also how do we challenge it, that because we inherit it. Just because we inherit it doesn't mean we need to carry it on. And so one thing that we really want, and I try with the class, but like this is something across, is like empathy, right? We want to get away from that apathy where you know you don't care. We definitely want to get away from the unaware. And we want to start like piquing that interest and getting the concern, but we really, really want to get to that empathy and compassion, right? To start to validate that experience of others, but then also try to improve it. So that's where that anti-racism comes in, because it's constantly trying to challenge and then improve.
And so I always ask, well, I do this in a small group, we can do it. Taylor, do you feel like you're an empathetic person?
Looking at these, I feel like I'm an empathetic person.
All right, I'm going to give you some questions.
Okay.
On a daily basis, on average, what would be your level of empathy? Or do you feel you like this on a scale of 1 to 10?
I'm a teacher, but I feel like it's high. I would say it's probably like an 8 to a 9.
All right. let's say you're driving to work, right? You're trying to get there a little bit early, you're ready to put your lesson plan. You stop at Dunkin', you get your cappuccino, maybe a latte. You pull out.
Starbucks.
Starbucks, sorry, Starbucks. You get the Starbucks.
Okay.
You're like, timed it perfectly, like, you know what the line's gonna be like and everything. You pre-order, you show up, you get it, you pull away, you spill your coffee all over yourself, maybe on some of your papers. In that moment, are you still 8 out of 10 in terms of empathy?
No, I think it goes down, right? 'Cause I'm like mad at myself too, right? I'm just like, oh, why me?
Right? And so I always ask folks, I'm like, situationally, even though we aspire to be, these people who are empathetic, and we may be on a regular basis, that situations in life and dynamics in life often change our ability to be present, to be those empathetic people we aspire and want to be, and hold ourselves to be. I always hear about good people. He's a good person. Oh, I can't believe this person did that. He's such a great person. Oh, I can't believe she did this. She's such a great person. People are inherently good people. And because of the fact that we're so quick to dismiss, right? Like, it's like a very dismissal, like, oh, somebody does something bad, they're bad. No, like, most people I think are good, right? But the indifference, those blind spots, right, that come when we're not in a full state of empathy, we basically create blind spots, and we can't see the way in which our behavior, our actions apply to others, right? So I always say, what does your partner think about you and your loved one? How about your siblings, your sister, your brother? How about your parents? What about your coworkers? Do they think you're empathetic? How about your boss? How about the people that work for you? Like, do they think that you're an empathetic person? And when we ask that question, generally what I hear in the group is like, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if they all say like I'm at the high level that I think I'm at in terms of empathy. And that goes for me too. Like, I'm sure if you talk to some of my staff, they'd be like, I don't know if Joe's an 8 out of 10 every day. Like it depends on minute by minute how he's feeling. But that's real, and it's important for us to be consciously in that state, because what I'm trying to do is to showcase that if we can acknowledge that even though we aspire to be good people, that we have blind spots, then we can at least be humble about those blind spots to recognize that they can create hardship for other people, right? And I think it's important for us.
And I put this on, but go Target, but I got this on Instagram, but I love this. I blew it up from my room. It's the journey of empathy, right? So we start, and in this case, they were doing this with learning Black history in school, and then understanding privilege, then educating and leading to speaking up, and then that's where empathy and solidarity lives, right? So it's not enough just to learn that history, but it's really understand and then become these people that are standing up and understanding what people are going through and saying, if it's happening to you, it's happening to me. Kind of like what Joe was saying earlier, we're not all free until everybody is free.
I'll jump through these. It's just important to, because I want to get to identity with Taylor. So it's just important to be active listeners, right? Just be present in the moment. If you're like me and you sort of get ADD, I like to repeat papers, imagine the words in my mind as if they're talking to me, so I can remember and attach onto it, so I'm not thinking about grab my cell phone and do something else. It's important to be present in the moment and hear people when they're sharing information that's critical about their own individuals' journeys.
Yeah, I think active listening sometimes is really hard because when someone says something, then it kind of just makes everything go blank in your head and you want your point to go and your back gets up. So it's really important to kind of stop and really think and engage on this.
And then real quick, whatever your identity is, male, Black male, conservative, Christian, criminal, color, documented citizen, undocumented, college graduate, able-bodied individual, white woman, middle class, you bring those experiences and those identities into wherever space that you're in. So this notion of leave yourself at the door is just false. And it's okay. As long as you're conscious of creating space for others, and bringing those identities in, and checking your biases and privileges, that's what we're asking. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of a big change from back in the day where people would say, I'm colorblind. I don't see that, right? And they were thinking that was a response. And in fact, we're saying no, right? You need to invalidate the experiences people have and the identities that they bring with them.
So really effective strategies, looking up and sidetracking the conversation, trying to appease folks, trying to terminate the discussion. A lot of educators out there, they're just like, I thought I addressed it, no, you said stop, stop and knock it off. And that doesn't, fix the situation. It ends like maybe the issue you're in the moment, but it does nothing to recalibrate the space for the person that felt offended. It does nothing in terms of accountability for the individual who committed the offense, and it just makes people feel generally unsupported. So obviously don't become offensive. You go to the next set in terms of effective strategies. Understand where folks are coming from in terms of their racial cultural identity, or whatever identity they carry. Acknowledge, be open to thinking about your biases. Validate, facilitate discussions on feelings, because feelings are important. Control the process to make, not the content, right? So make sure you create structures to make it feel safe. But folks got some truth telling in there has to also be told. So you got to make sure that you're not overstepping and prohibiting somebody from engaging in conversation that's critical because it's incumbent. You just want to make sure that you're having a conversation that's structured, that makes sure that, particularly the folks who have been marginalized and oppressed and offended, are protected in that conversation. And then make sure just to validate it. It's important to really validate folks where they're coming from and support and encourage them when they speak out. Because I promise you, the folks that speak out are some of the most courageous folks in their institutions, in their communities, because they're challenging the norm of the system of folks that feel easily comfortable ignoring that the system is. And it's never easy stepping out and doing that. You need to encourage some of those folks and protect them, because apparently what they're saying is that I have enough of a respect for this organization's, institution's community to say exactly what I feel in an effort to make it better. And that's good. Those are good things to do.
So one activity that is important, and something for me, I always ask the students to do, and maybe take a moment and look at these. These are two different types of identity wheels. They have, about the same thing in there, but thinking about your identity and all these different parts of your identity. Of course, there's way more to you, right? Like I have a dog, and I'm an aunt, whatever. Like there's more to you, but when we're looking at this, how does this identity kind of influence how you see the world? Kind of like those lenses that Joe was showing. So my students make this identity wheel, and so I made one where I didn't do the wheel per se, because I didn't know how to do that online. And then I told Joe to do one too. So we both did ours, and we found out we're the same age, so it makes sense why we both like baking and crazy. And so looking at like our race, we talk about gender, sexual orientation, are you documented? And of course, like I always say, like if you don't feel comfortable filling one of these out, then that's totally fine. But I like to be very honest with them of what I am and what I bring to the table, and how that views kind of my thing as well. And then Joe, here's Joe's, much better picture, Joe, I get it. But I think it's also really important to talk about like the mental health issues and stuff like that, because we're the stigma there, and how like sometimes anxiety can play a role with our reaction to certain things too. So being open about that is really important. And when you look at this and think about what identities do you think about the most, right? So I am more likely to be aware of being a woman many times in situations, right? So like at nighttime, I know I check the back seat multiple times of my car. Even though I've checked it 50 times, I'm gonna check it 51 times, right? But the ones I think least about a lot of times is being a white person, right? So a lot of times when you think about those identities that you think about most often, are a lot of times where you see that you don't have as many privileges compared to those that you have the least of. So I want you to kind of thinking about that. And Joe, what do you think with like the reflection-wise?
What identities do I often most think about? I mean, I definitely think about being black. That's like something that ever since I can remember, I just have to be conscious of, right? Like that's the part. When people see me and their interaction with me is definitely around like my blackness and then me being like a male. The ones I probably think about the least, that's a really good question. I probably don't think often about my, sexual orientation because I don't have to do them straight. So like, nobody gives me grief over it. It's not like something that people harass me or bother me over or discriminate against me. I often don't think about the fact that I'm English speaking first, right? I don't think about the fact that I was born and raised in this country and have papers. You know, I'm not nervous when I'm driving down the street, or I'm not nervous when I'm applying for a job. You know, I just don't think about it. So, you know.
And that's where like some of, we hold these privileges, and I think it gets that conversation thinking of different parts of you, that everyone has some power, right? To continue to say some people do not have any privilege or have any power. We all have some kind of privilege and power, and to use that as a way to stand up for those that don't necessarily have that privilege. I thought the interesting one too is like geographic location. Obviously, someone that grew up in the South, and then I'm now up in New England, right? And just thinking of the differences of where you live and how that can impact that. And so the other one's thinking about how people perceive you, like what's the first thing people see you when they think you, or kind of what you were saying, Joe, and how you perceive others, right? So some of those biases that keep coming in, and sometimes your identities can affect to it. And we just talked about how it's so important. We kind of discussed this really, like how it's so important, but like also identity helps us see multiple perspectives of the same event, right? So I might be seeing something, looking at an historical event, or something happening today, and have one kind of view on it. Joe, you might have another, and then another person has another. And it's great to learn from each other about it. And so, I love that little thing. So we've talked, this was one of the things from Stamped, and if you've read it, like, they talk a lot about what the consequences are about omitting talking about racism and anti-racism. And I wanted to share a couple quotes from, I did this with some students, and here's some things of what students in the community are kind of saying. I had a student said it's important to acknowledge the anti-racists and how they're taking power into their own hands to get that power back. It's very important to show that there's power, and a lot of times we only show it as like these people in these high-level positions, like presidents, but really how important common everyday people and what impact they can have. It says, as one kid said, this gives us a full understanding of people in history, why they did what they did, and why current events are happening today. We all want to know what the heck is happening and why it's happening today, right? And so looking back on this is so important with it. And one of the students said it's your job if you have privileges to make a change. And one student talked about how their ancestors were not a part of history if they're going to be left out. If we go back to kind of like what we've seen in the past, their ancestors are kept out of it. And we always say, like, if you take a picture of a group and you're in that group, the first thing we all do when we look at that picture is look for ourselves, right? And do I look cute in this picture? And that's how our students and what we all do, we all kind of gravitate looking for things that we can relate to. And so if we're keeping parts out, one, we don't have the whole history, and two, we're going to see a lot of people disengage from it. And then one student had said, and I was like, can I write this down? Let me write this, right? The lack of knowledge leads to fear. Fear leads to the lack of knowledge. These kids they're reading this for U.S. history, they've been reading this book, and will continue to read this book, and the things that they're getting out of it has been pretty worthwhile. And of course we said, like, how are this, we're seeing some of this in our everyday, talking about some bills, talking about racism, people talking about critical race theory. I can't tell you how many people asked me this summer about this, and about people talking about not discussing racism, where there's such bills and bill passed into laws that are happening. And it's not just in my home area of the South, as you can see, that this is Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maine, there's been talked to some in Massachusetts as well. And it's just important to talk about how racism is kind of woven into the fabric, and just like we've been talking through about this, of what can we do now that we know that. So Joe, you want to take this part?
Sure, what we do in this next slide. I think that folks just have to do the work. I know we're short on time, so I don't know how much I can get into, but I'll just say real quick, self-assessment is really where it's at. And doing the training as adults on our own time to really, specific anti-racism work is great. We was a student in New Orleans, props to them, they've been doing this for decades. Helping people understand historically what's happening so they can make sense of today, right? How do we get conditioned to this sort of system where we think that thinking of somebody's skin, determines the value of their work, right? We need to understand that so we can deconstruct that into our minds. And then some training education on our own part in terms of self-assessments, Where am I on this journey? What am I trying to learn? Who are my allies in terms of folks I can work with, to ask questions, to engage in conversation, to educate myself, but also to educate collectively ourselves in this work. Next slide.
Yeah, just saying, like, you gotta do the work. Like, there's work, and you gotta do it, so.
I know we got like 2 minutes left. You want to jump to another slide, Kayla, or you want to take questions?
Yeah, if there's any questions or comments, I knew we could talk forever, so.
We do have a few questions in the chat. There's a slight delay on our YouTube stream, so I want to open it back up at this point if anybody would like to add any more questions in the chat, and go ahead and ask the one that we got. You covered it a little bit already, but how can educators be political in states that ban discussions of racism in any form?
Okay, so sorry, it was a little hard to hear. How can what?
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, that is better.
Okay. How can educators be political in states that ban discussions of racism in any form?
It's really, I'm talking to some people that are other educators. One of the things is like if it's banned, but like if you're teaching history and teaching the standards and it's embedded in history, if you're teaching history, there's no way that you're not teaching this stuff, right? So looking at some of the standards, even in Massachusetts, if they were to pass something like this, and looking at like the clauses of the Constitution and some of the things with the Electoral College, like it's still going to be able to come through. And that's one strong part about it, is that this is, if you're telling the truth about the history, then it's still going to be there.
There were some folks, so this started years ago. I referenced it in one of the slides of the ethnic study program at Arizona that ended up going to the Supreme Court where it was overturned. And unfortunately, those freedom fighters who fought for that ethnic studies program ended up all transitioning out of public education and were teaching in higher ed or teaching other districts. But they won that lawsuit, and although it was allowed to stand for 3 years, it's now been removed, and ethnic studies are being taught within Arizona. So all these bans in ethnic studies and this ridiculous conversation around CRT, which most people don't even know what it is, what it means, what it's about. All of this is just pushback from a system, right? From people who don't understand, or maybe unwilling to understand or acknowledge the implication of race and how it continues to play a role. And this is like the perfect example, right? Like trying to ban history, right? The teaching of history. But if we don't teach history, then how can our kids learn empathy and compassion, right, for individuals that they may not know, or have an appreciation for what can go wrong when hate is allowed to manifest in the community, right? I use the example of me going to the Holocaust Museum in DC and sitting there in that moment and probably having one of the most greatest appreciations for the hardship that Jewish Americans that have had to live with in terms of history, right? And also that Jewish people have had to live with in terms of what happened as part of the Holocaust, right? And although I wasn't connected to it, I feel a fundamental obligation to support the Jewish community and ensure that no level of hate or vitriol is allowed to stand, because their inherent safety and freedom is directly correlated and tied to money, right? And that's the place where we say that in places where there are places we can experience oppression, but there are also places that we can experience privilege. And in those places where we can experience, for some folks that can experience privilege, being a male, being a citizen, being able-bodied, I can use those privileges to facilitate a process that creates inclusion and protection for those who may not have that experience in the place where they experience lives. It's all collectively tied together. And the more that we teach history, truth-telling in history, the more our kids understand that what to expect, or words to hear, or similarities in terms of hate speech that lead to much more aggressive actions that can harm not just the individual person who's being discriminated against, but it can threaten everybody's freedom. Right? I think if anything we learned over the last few years in this country is that the words that people say are, believe the words that people say when they say them because they mean them.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have any additional questions in the chat. There's anybody in the room that would like to ask any questions? Okay, so Taylor and Joe, I don't know if you have anything that you sort of like to leave us with as last thoughts before we wrap things up.
How do I want to leave? Well, we put my email's up there. If anyone has any questions, comments, Joe's is up there as well. If you'd like to ask us questions or have anything you want to talk about or want some of the resources that we've used, we're here for that. And I just think continue to engage in these kind of conversations. It is life-changing, and it is getting you to understand, lean into that discomfort, really, and to continue to do the work. Joe, what would you like to say?
I want to just say it's been great to virtually meet all of you, and just as I said, just continue to do the work, and don't be discouraged by the individuals who try to stop us from doing the work. We encourage other folks to continue to do it. So I'm encouraged every day by educators in Framingham, students, community leaders who are unafraid to say Black Lives Matter, or unafraid to push for equity and inclusion. We say explicitly diversity does matter, and we're trying to create a process where, as a community, we become a shining example of what can happen when we put a spotlight on trying to deconstruct systems that have historically existed. So, peace to all y'all, and I hope you have a good night.
Have a great night. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much again. We really appreciate you both being here. So thanks all to you for coming here both in person tonight and also online. We'd like to invite you to join us for some forthcoming events. As I mentioned in my intro, we have a number of events surrounding issues of anti-racism, especially here in the Framingham community. One of the upcoming events that we have is actually happening this Sunday. It's on training active bystanders. So it is a training session that is designed for people who want to have more knowledge about how to help out people if they feel like there is an unsafe or a challenging situation. So we invite you to join us for that. I mentioned Nic Stone will be coming to the Public Library October 6th. And I'd also like to invite you all to join us for our community conversation. It's going to be a community-wide conversation facilitated by Dr. Barnes, Lisa McDonald, and Chief Lester Baker. That's all going to be on Zoom. And if you'd like more information about any of the events, please visit our website, www.framinghamlibrary.org/FRT. That's F as in Frank, R as in Richard, T as in Thomas. And thank you both again so much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming tonight.
Yeah, it was really informative.
Yeah.
A lot of things there. Yeah.
Awesome. And it's nice to have an audience again, too.
Yeah, small audience, but.
That's all right.
At least one, yeah.
An audience is an audience. And we had about 11 people online, too.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Hope to see you at future events.
Yeah, you said Sunday bystander training, huh?
Bystander training, please do go ahead and register. It is a Zoom-only event.
Okay.
And there is a limited number of people that can attend because it's an active training session.
Right.
So if it's something you're interested in, you do want to reserve your spot.
Okay, all right, yeah, consider that.
Yeah, just check out our website.
All right. Do you know what he was saying about the in Arizona, the CR2 law?
I don't.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that
It's